Hello, let's go look new video.
How do I motivate myself to do boring tasks? It was the same routine every morning. I woke up, sluggish and tired, dreading the thought of another day spent tackling a pile of tasks that felt like they had no purpose. I was good at my job, but there were parts of it I absolutely despised. The never-ending reports, the mind-numbing data entry, the endless meetings that felt like a waste of time. All of it drained me. No matter how much I tried to psych myself up, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was wasting my time. I felt stuck in a cycle where the tasks at hand were either too repetitive or too tedious to even try to enjoy. My colleagues seemed fine with it. They powered through the work, smiling at the small victories, celebrating when a report was finally submitted or a meeting concluded. But not me. I was left wondering, how do I motivate myself to do boring tasks? One day, after another long stretch of dragging my feet through the day, I decided that I couldn't keep going like this. The fatigue, frustration, and lack of motivation were taking a toll on me. I needed to find a way to make these boring tasks manageable or risk burning out. I started asking myself why I was so uninspired and came up with a few realizations that I hoped might help me break free from the rut. Understanding the why. The first step toward motivation, I realized, was understanding why I felt so unmotivated in the first place. Why did these tasks seem so unbearable? The answers weren't always clear, but I tried to dig deeper. For one, I realized that I wasn't finding any purpose in the work I was doing. Data entry didn't excite me, and drafting reports felt like a chore. I wasn't seeing how these tasks contributed to anything meaningful. It wasn't just the tasks themselves. It was the lack of meaning that made them feel so boring. This insight, though simple, was crucial. I had been approaching my tasks with a mindset of just get it done, rather than thinking about why they mattered or how they contributed to the bigger picture. The truth was, even the most mundane tasks played a role in something larger. Without those reports, the team wouldn't have the data they needed. Without the meetings, important decisions wouldn't be made. I wasn't just checking off boxes. I was part of a team, and everything I did mattered, even if it didn't always feel like it. Reframing the task. I started experimenting with reframing how I viewed the tasks. Instead of seeing them as burdens, I began to think of them as stepping stones. What would happen if I took a different approach? What if I could see each task as an opportunity to prove to myself that I could get through something difficult? What if I could find a way to make even the most boring task rewarding? I decided to start small. The next time I sat down to work on a report, I focused on completing one section at a time, treating each one like a mini goal. There was something satisfying about seeing the progress, even in small increments. Each completed section felt like a little victory. It wasn't about getting the entire thing done in one sitting, but about building momentum. The same approach worked for the data entry. Instead of getting lost in the mind-numbing rows of numbers, I started to treat it like a puzzle. I would set small targets, like, I'll finish this column in 10 minutes, or I'll complete 5 rows, then take a quick break. Breaking the task down into bite-sized pieces made it feel less overwhelming and more like a game. I wasn't magically in love with the work, but by focusing on one piece at a time, I started to feel a sense of control. The idea of completing the entire task felt daunting, but tackling one small section at a time made it feel more manageable. The progress was slow, but it was progress nonetheless. And progress, however small, can be motivating. Building small rewards into the day. One of the most effective strategies I started using was building small rewards into my workday. When the task ahead felt boring or difficult, I would promise myself a treat once I completed it. I would use this as a tool to give myself something to look forward to, a way to motivate myself during the harder moments. For instance, after completing a report or meeting a deadline, I would allow myself to take a break and enjoy something I really liked. A cup of coffee from my favorite cafe, a few minutes spent scrolling through a book I was reading, or listening to a song I loved. These small, pleasurable rewards made the boring tasks a bit more bearable. They gave me something to focus on beyond the task itself. I also started using rewards to break up the workday. After completing a set amount of work, I'd take a short walk or spend a few minutes meditating. These breaks helped clear my mind and gave me the energy to tackle the next task with a refreshed perspective. At first, these rewards felt like small distractions from the real work, but over time, they became integral to my workflow. I began to see that motivation didn't always have to come from loving the task itself. Sometimes, it came from finding ways to make the experience more enjoyable and giving myself a reason to keep going. The small rewards helped me feel like I was accomplishing something beyond just ticking boxes. Gamifying the work. One of the most powerful methods I used to motivate myself was gamifying my tasks. I've always been someone who enjoys a challenge, but when it comes to work, the challenge often feels absent. So, I started introducing elements of gamification into my workday. For example, when I had to tackle a large stack of data, I treated it like a race against the clock. How quickly could I get through it without sacrificing accuracy? How efficiently could I finish a task while still ensuring the work was done right? By setting time-based challenges, I turned the process into something competitive against the clock, not myself. I also began to track my productivity in a more visual way. I used a habit tracking app to set daily goals and watch the bar of progress slowly fill up as I completed each task. Seeing that bar fill up was incredibly satisfying, and it motivated me to keep going. I wasn't just doing tasks. I was leveling up each time I completed one. This sense of progression made even the most boring task feel like part of a larger game. Additionally, I started competing against myself. Each day, I tried to beat my previous time or finish a task with greater efficiency. When I beat my best, I'd reward myself with something more substantial. This created a cycle of continuous improvement and added a layer of fun to work that I hadn't expected. Accepting boredom as part of the process. At some point, I realized that some tasks would always be boring, and I needed to accept that. Rather than constantly fighting against the boredom, I started to embrace it as part of the process. I reminded myself that it's okay to do boring things sometimes. Not every moment at work is going to be exciting or fulfilling, and that's fine. By accepting that some tasks are inherently dull, I stopped placing unnecessary pressure on myself to love them. I learned that it's not about making every task enjoyable. It's about finding ways to push through the boring parts while still maintaining a sense of purpose. The acceptance of boredom itself became empowering. I stopped feeling guilty for not loving every aspect of my job. I focused on what I could control, the way I approached those tasks. I knew that boring tasks didn't have to define my entire workday. I could still find meaning and satisfaction elsewhere, even if it wasn't in every little task. After accepting that boredom was an inevitable part of many tasks, I began to experiment with ways to find flow even in the most monotonous work. Flow is that magical state where you're so deeply immersed in what you're doing that time seems to fly. It's what happens when you're so engaged in a task that it doesn't feel like work anymore. I had heard about flow before, but never thought it could apply to something as dull as entering data or writing reports. But one day, while I was mindlessly plugging numbers into a spreadsheet, I decided to try something different. I focused on the rhythm of my typing and the smoothness of moving from one task to the next. I began to clear my mind of distractions and focused solely on the task in front of me. The more I tuned into the act of completing the task, the more I found myself entering a sort of zone. It wasn't an overnight transformation. At first, it was just small moments of concentration where I could zone out the noise and find peace in the task itself. Slowly, I started to get better at this. Instead of resenting the work, I began to lean into the repetition, making it a kind of meditative process. The flow state didn't mean the work became any more exciting, but it did make it easier to get through. The task became less of an obstacle to endure and more of a puzzle to solve, something that felt manageable rather than overwhelming. I learned that flow can happen in the most unexpected places if you let go of the desire for things to be thrilling. When I focused less on the end result and more on the process of completing the task, the boring work didn't seem so bad. The key was to stay present and make the process of the task itself interesting, rather than waiting for something magical to happen at the end. Creating a productive environment. Another strategy one employed to tackle boring tasks was altering my environment. Sometimes, the environment in which I worked played a huge role in my motivation levels. If I was working at my desk, surrounded by clutter, noise, or distractions, I'd find it impossible to focus. I knew that to succeed at doing boring work, I had to create a space that encouraged focus and minimized distractions. I began by organizing my desk, removing anything unnecessary, and putting up a few items that brought me joy, like a picture of my family or a quote that inspired me. I also made sure to keep only the tools I needed for the task at hand within reach. Having a clean, clutter-free workspace allowed me to feel more in control of my environment and, in turn, my work. But beyond the physical space, I also started playing ambient music while I worked. Not music with lyrics that would distract me, but calming instrumental sounds that helped me concentrate. The right background music made the boring tasks feel less dull and helped me enter a state of concentration. It became a kind of rhythm for my work, almost like a soundtrack to the mundane. I also realized that my mental environment mattered just as much as the physical one. When I went into work with the mindset that the task was going to be awful, it often became self-fulfilling. On the other hand, when I tried to approach it with a more open attitude, or even a sense of humor, the task didn't seem as bad. It wasn't always easy to shift my mindset, but I found that the more I did, the easier it became to handle even the most tedious work. The power of accountability. Another thing I discovered was the power of accountability. When I was working alone, it was easy to procrastinate or let myself off the hook when I didn't feel like doing something boring. But when I shared my goals with others, I had more motivation to follow through. It could be as simple as telling a friend or family member that I was going to finish a report by the end of the day. Knowing that someone else knew my goal made me feel more accountable to finish the task. I also found accountability in the form of small milestones. I started keeping track of my daily tasks on a whiteboard or in a planner. I'd write down everything I had to do that day and cross off each task once it was completed. It wasn't just about checking off boxes. It was about seeing how far I had come and how much I had accomplished. By the end of the day, that list of crossed-off tasks provided a sense of pride and achievement, even if those tasks had been boring. There was something about seeing the progress I had made that fueled me to keep going. It wasn't the tasks themselves that were motivating, but the satisfaction of being able to look back and say, I did it. The visual representation of my accomplishments gave me a sense of forward momentum, which made even the most dull tasks feel more worthwhile. The just start principle. One of the most profound lessons I learned was the importance of just starting. Often, I found that the hardest part of tackling boring tasks was getting started. The anticipation of having to do something tedious or difficult was often worse than the task itself. Once I got into it, I realized that the task wasn't as bad as I had built it up to be in my mind. So, I adopted the just start principle. When I was faced with a boring task, I would tell myself, just start and see how it goes. This simple mantra helped me push through the initial resistance. I'd tell myself that I didn't have to finish it all at once or even do it perfectly. I just needed to begin. Once I started, the momentum would take over. I'd find myself getting more involved in the work, even if it wasn't exciting. Just starting the task took away the pressure of having to be perfect or getting it done all at once. It made the task feel less daunting and more like something I could handle. The act of starting, in and of itself, was often the biggest hurdle to overcome. Celebrating small wins. As I started implementing these strategies, I realized that one of the most important aspects of staying motivated with boring tasks was celebrating the small wins. Often, we wait for big moments of success to feel good about our work, but the real motivation can come from recognizing the smaller achievements. After completing a task, I would take a moment to acknowledge my effort. It didn't matter if the task was small or boring. I would give myself credit for finishing it. Even if the task seemed insignificant, it was a win. This shift in mindset helped me appreciate the small victories and stay motivated to keep going. I started to see every report completed, every row of data entered, and every meeting attended as a small success. The more I celebrated these moments, the more I felt a sense of accomplishment. And that, in turn, made me more motivated to tackle the next boring task.